Hi everyone, my name is Alisée. I'm one of the co-founders of SeedStars. We're a Swiss investment holding company and we've been investing on the continent for the past 10 years, but also supporting the ecosystem. Before joining the panel, we thought it would be interesting to share you how we've built our impact thesis and how we've gone about investing on the continent, but also in other regions around the world. And in many ways, like you entrepreneurs or other fund managers, which are ultimately entrepreneurs themselves, we had to scale up by, in many ways, internalizing the whole value chain. So when there were ecosystems that didn't have enough investment-ready companies, it didn't feel right for us to say, let's just wait another 5-10 years for the ecosystem to become ripe. Let's get in from the get-go by supporting the ecosystems with other needs. So my journey started more than 10 years ago when I was initially selling very expensive lipstick with L'Oréal, and as much as I learned a lot, I more importantly learned what I did not want to do. And I think I came across the quote of Eleanor Roosevelt that said, do one thing every day that scares you. So ultimately in 2013, I took a flight and I came to Cape Town, which was one of the 20 destinations in the first SeedStars World Tour. And went paragliding the next day and nearly crashed into the mountains. So Cape Town was a great experience firsthand. So we left this kind of postcard Switzerland to a more chaotic reality. We then moved to Nigeria to launch our first incubation center, because in that was an enormous opportunity. So the mission of SeedStars hasn't changed. We're here to improve people's lives by backing entrepreneurs with know-how, community, and capital, figuring out that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Why? Because our thesis is, if you look at the UN Development Goals, there's still a lot to be done. And it's impacting heavily the more emerging and frontier markets. And we can see that simply because there's still not enough dignified and sustainable jobs that in many ways can be symbolically seen in the gap of GDP between the more developed economies and the emerging ones. So at SeedStars, we believe what evidence has shown again and again in Europe and around the world, that there is this small percentage of companies that have a disproportionate impact on job creation and GDP growth. There was a report in the UK about this famous 6%, and since there has been many private public institutions that have looked on the African continent and identified between 4 to 7% of these companies. And so for SeedStars, it was in many ways, let's find, support, and invest in the 6%. These 6% also have a tendency to be more disruptive, more innovative, and use technology to scale the impact. So we look at the high growth ventures, which in the jargon is more the startups, but there's also more those dynamic and niche ventures that really build the economy as we know. And of course, this is where it becomes interesting, is that we see it has an accelerated impact on key sectors from financial services to healthcare. So at SeedStars, I was mentioning before, when I try to explain what we do coming from Europe, they feel like they have the luxury to focus. You want to launch an e-commerce, you have websites available, you have the post office that works, you have warehouse facilities that can stock your produce. Your consumer has been educated on online payment, you have different options. You can focus on building an e-commerce. As you're scaling in Africa or investing in Africa and other emerging continents, what we realize is that you kind of have to start internalizing because the infrastructure, the ecosystem is yet not ripe. So at SeedStars, we could not have the luxury in many ways to come in and just invest. It's about really identifying the ecosystem and strengthening it on the long term. So we started to build SeedStars Capital, SeedStars Live, SeedStars World that built this community. We have training programs. We're launching schools in different countries and also now doing advisory to public and private institutions to try and educate them faster so that we can see a real reallocation of capital, expertise, and talent in these markets. And of course, we can't pretend to do it, so we by coming from Switzerland. So we have a team global, but more importantly, working with the local ESOs, the Enterprise Support Organizations, which are many present here today that represent the South African ecosystem, but also different ecosystems across the continent. So all this makes sense if we can build a stronger impact framework and measurement tool. Einstein once said, if you can't explain it to your 6-year-old or to a 6-year-old, it means you don't understand it. So I took the task to try and build our theory of change with my 6-year-old son's toys and try to explain to him what impact looked like for us. And in the upcoming panel, we're also going to discuss kind of what are the indicators we track to like successfully identify a successful partnership or a successful venture. So of course, key financial metrics are important, but for us, it's also identifying other indicators and sometimes still identifying a collaborative, positive collaboration, may it be with the investee, the entrepreneur we invested in, or may it be with the enterprise support organization we're working with, or may it be with our LPs, our investors that go through our funds and our programs. And so basically it's the story of one of the Dragon Ball Z characters that through know-how, capital, and community can start becoming more and more powerful and getting third-party investors to make the world a better place. So you see, I understand it. Now the whole deal, again, we're not obsessed only by the unicorn. The unicorns come in for very specific investment thesis. If you believe as an entrepreneur you should be VC-backed, venture-backed, then you have a trajectory to believe that you will become one of the unicorn. And what we want to see for unicorns, but also for the other SMEs in general on the continent, is that the pie gets bigger and more equitable, because the reality is today, if you just think in terms of venture capital, less than 5% of venture capital is allocated to what is still considered rest of the world, even though it represents more than 50% of the population, and that's putting aside India and China, of course. As we're also going to talk about globalization and partnerships, I wanted to give you examples of companies also outside of the African continent. With our early stage global fund, we invest in now over 40 countries around the world. Also to give you a sense that there's a lot of similarities of companies you have seen rising on the African continent. We sometimes have the obsession that global means sometimes going to the States or Europe, but there's so much more similarities sometimes between the emerging markets. And you can see, and examples will show later, that sometimes a market like the Philippines makes much more sense than even going to your neighboring country. So looking at LATAM, for example, give you some quick macro facts. The fintech market is expected to reach nearly 300 billion by 2025. So accessing the consumer, like in Africa, will be through mobile phones, will be through fintech solutions, because most people are still the unbanked. And we invested 5 years ago in Baobab, a consumer micro-lending platform, very similar to many companies here in Africa. And for us, of course, we track their financial growth, and they're doing extremely well going into their next follow-on funding. But we track also the number of direct sustainable jobs they've built, over 100 employees now. We track how many beneficiaries, the unbanked consumers they have supported. We're getting now close to 200,000 beneficiaries. And with that, they've been able to disperse a total 400 million and secured now $120 million coming from international debt funders. Looking at Africa, one of our earlier investments that we made with our first fund, we need to keep in mind that we're getting to 700 million in subscription for mobile phones just in sub-Saharan Africa, which is an immense opportunity. And so many ways it's kind of exasperated by examples like Omni Retail, which is a marketplace that we invested in Nigeria, which connects a B2B e-commerce between FMSG manufacturers and retailers. One of the more profitable business right now in Africa, getting a lot of attention, but also more importantly, they're reaching 75 employees. They have close to 200,000 retailers that they support, and nearly 80% of them are women. women that still every statistic and evidence has shown are not receiving the same access to finance and capability to become a more sustainable business themselves. So it's going through these high growth companies that we also can target more marginalized communities, these micro entrepreneurs, small SMEs, to help them grow and scale. And that for us is high impact. And finally, if we go to Asia, as we invest across all continents, when we started in 2013 and launched the first competition, we met with Gibran from e-fishery in Indonesia, similar companies also in Africa doing the same, basically a smart IoT so that you can better optimize the feeding system for fish and shrimp farming. I know South Africa is also big on that. Well, it's going to represent over 200 billion in Asia Pacific, Indonesia being one of the biggest markets. And when we met him in 2013, he did everything wrong in terms of how to pitch to an investor. Barely spoke English, came from a rural farm in the middle of Indonesia, didn't understand that he had to be extremely bullish on the market size, on understanding the cap table and how he had to secure his deal. Yet, and we know it takes time, and it's frustrating sometimes that the ecosystem doesn't allow us for time. 10 years later, he's the first global aquaculture unicorn. He has raised Series C with nearly 300 million, and the big institutional investors like Temasek and other sovereign funds that have invested in him. So just also a reminder that it takes a lot of time, and that, of course, from a market least expected 10, 11 years ago, he becomes a global player in aquaculture and its future. So here's kind of the portfolio that has expanded. And I think next step for SeedStars is what we think we have done well with the entrepreneurs. There's still a gap in terms of the capital allocation. So how can we support first-time, second-time fund managers in scaling? And so it's figuring out where can we back those kind of unicorn VCs in many ways who have very similar traits, characteristics, and personality to those founders that we strive for. And it all comes down still to a human interaction, which from us started from a global perspective. So the peer-to-peer engagement is wonderful and proves that entrepreneurship is a universal language. Thank you very much.